Live streaming is on.
Okay. Seth, maybe? Just gonna... Now I want to unpin you. There we go. Why is there audio feedback?
Can anyone hear me? Is your name Seth?
Yes, I'm Seth Wagswift.
Oh, hi, nice to meet you.
Likewise.
I can't hear Aaron or the host.
Can you hear me now, Glenn?
Yeah, someone just talked.
I definitely can't hear the host, or maybe I'm just not listening.
Yeah, no. On my end of things,
I muted myself when I did that.
Yeah, there we go.
Why don't we do a hand signal like I can hear you, and then you can see that we.
Sorry, yeah, I muted everybody else because I was getting audio feedback from somebody's loop, and I was trying to figure out what it was. Okay, let me share my screen. Share my screen. This is going super well. Okay, so intro to FFF or FDM 3D printing. If you are a member of Twin Cities Maker, this is going to be the checkoff class for the FDM or FFF 3D printers in the class. I'll explain what those acronyms mean in a minute. But there is a resin 3D printing class that is for the resin printer in specific. There are two different distinct technologies, so this is just going to cover the ones with filament today. Please feel free to stop me at any point if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. But other than that, we'll just get right into it. So FDM or FFF, what is it? How does it work? Glenn, did you have a question?
Actually, you answered it. I was wondering if that was the button. This is only the second time I've used Jitsi.
Okay.
And so now I know how to raise my hand. Sorry.
Sounds good. Okay, so FFF, FDM, how does it work? So FFF, or Fused Filament Fabrication 3D Printing, is at its core a pretty simple technology. Basically what you have is a fancy hot glue gun for dispensing plastic that takes a filament of some type of thermoplastic and spits it out onto a build surface, and then moves up, draws another layer, does that many dozens or hundreds of times, and then you've built up your 3D part. In a more technical sense, you have an extruder. That's your fancy hot glue gun. That's going to take your filament. This is a long thread or strand of thermoplastic that comes in a couple of sizes and a bunch of different materials. It's going to take that filament, force it through an extruder, which pushes it out the hot end. That puts it out onto a build plate. You're going to draw a layer on the build surface, and then you're going to move up on the z-axis and then draw another layer, and so on and so on. Brian, did you have a question? Okay. The main, where was I? Yes, so that is how this technology works in general. It's honestly pretty simple. You'll see a bunch of different styles of this type of printer. Like in the lab, we have a bunch of different types of printers, but they all work on the same sort of technology, this FDM or FFF framework. FDM means fused deposition modeling. That term is trademarked still, which is why you'll sometimes see these referred to as FFF or fused filament fabrication 3D printers. They mean the same thing. So if you see those two terms, they mean the same thing. We're going to start with a quick look at how these work. The typical hobby grade RepRap 3D printer, RepRap is a open source project for 3D printers, looks something like this. This is a Prusa MK3S. We have 2 of these in the lab, but you'll notice that most of our printers in the lab look somewhat similar to this.
Yeah, Joseph, to interject, your screen is off, so we're not seeing anything.
You're not seeing anything. My screen is off. That's weird.
Okay. I was seeing the screen on your laptop or whatever, and now I see the screen again.
Okay.
But I don't know who else does.
Can everyone see this now?
All I see is the boxes with everybody's, and then I see a gray screen.
Can
Me as
somebody
well.
else? Oh, Brian, we're getting feedback from your mic. Aaron, can you see this?
No,
No.
I cannot.
Okay, let me.
I'm on the standard Jitsi home screen
Okay.
when you're just a black J right now.
Okay, let me do something. Okay, can you see my video stream now?
When you did that, I lost it. And now I see a whole bunch of boxes with some having live feed, others just the initials and names.
Okay, can you see my
Now-
whole screen?
Now I can.
Can everybody besides Glenn see this?
Still no. Let me refresh and try to come back in and see if that changes anything.
No, I can't see anything.
Why can some people see it?
Hey,
I've never had this issue with Jitsi before. Very strange.
when whatever you were doing there was causing me to have it returned 2 columns that are duplicates. You might actually have like 2 sessions going. I don't know.
No, I was sharing my entire screen, so you're probably seeing the video chat is on my screen as well. And nobody besides Glenn can see my screen now.
I
You
can.
can?
Yeah.
I can't.
I'm seeing the printer.
Okay. Brian?
No, I don't see anything.
I don't either.
Leave it come back and fix it for me.
Everything is technically difficult.
Okay. Against the chance that it helps, when I look at the column with the little blocks for each recipient, the ones that aren't seeing it have what looks like a folder with a diagonal line across it.
You know what? I figured this out. I'm just going to post a link to the presentation, and you can follow along in the presentation, just as a stopgap, because it should be showing you this. I'm sorry.
Where is the link
I
that
put
you're
it in the
sending?
chat. But Glenn, if you can see my screen, then you're good.
Joseph, it says we need access.
Oh my God! Come on! It said everybody with the link can open it. Change. Oh, okay. Anyone with the link can view. There. How about now?
That seemed to have worked. Thank you.
Okay.
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 Just for us, like leaving and waiting a couple seconds and coming back in did the trick for me.
Okay. Can everybody
Okay, I'm gonna try that.
mute? I'm getting some like chatter in the background.
Daddy, why can't they know?
Okay. So parts of a FFF or FDM 3D RepRap style 3D printer. There are a couple of different styles, but the one we're going to talk about here today is a Cartesian style 3D printer. This means that just what you think it means from like your geometry class or algebra class in high school, it works off of a Cartesian coordinate system, meaning that you have an x-axis, a y-axis, and a z-axis. The x, by convention, is going to be the tool head moving back and forth. The y, by convention, is going to be the bed moving back and forth, and then your z is going to be up. Those x and y don't really matter in relation to each other. They just need to be perfectly 90 degrees from each other. But the z is up instead of forward. This matters for if you're using some 3D modeling software. There's a setting for using for 3D printing that puts the z up instead of forward. Not a big deal. Just sometimes if you import a model and it's flat on its face, that's why somebody modeled it in Blender without changing that setting. So let's go over how these axes work. The x-axis. The x-axis and the y-axis work very similarly. You have some form of carriage. In this case, this is a bed carriage. This has the heated bed removed. And you can see there's a belt underneath it. That belt is affixed to that, and then there's a stepper motor in the back over here. That stepper motor is what drives that axis. Stepper motors are just a type of electric motor that when you send a pulse to it, it always moves a set number of degrees. In this case, this one moves 1.8 degrees whenever it gets a step. And you know, since that you have this belt that has a certain pitch and you have a gear with a certain number of teeth, that when I send it 100 pulses, it's going to move exactly 10 millimeters, or whatever the math works out to. The downside of stepper motors, if you know anything about them, is that they don't actually have any positional information. So it can skip steps, and that's happened. That can ruin prints. That's something that's called layer shifting. Generally, if you see a layer shift, you should kill the print because it's done. Unless you think you can cut the part apart later and glue it back together, there's no coming back from a layer shift. Because what will happen is that something caused it to, like something bumped into it, caused the bed to move, and then the printer just assumed that it was fine and kept going, and then everything is shifted over a little bit. You'll see also back here that there's this little switch here. That's called an end stop. It's just a simple momentary switch. And the printer uses that to, when it hits that, it knows, okay, this is 0. When you turn on a printer for the first time, or anytime you turn on a printer, the printer doesn't know where it is until it homes itself by hitting all of its end stops. The next we have is the x-axis. This works very similarly. You have a stepper motor over on the side, a belt hooking up to an a carriage that moves back and forth. There's another end stop. I believe the end stop on this one is on the left side of it. And then you have a z-axis. The z is up and down. In the case of many of this style of printer, there's 2 motors that control the z, and that's just to keep it as level as possible. Like the Enders that we have only have 1 motor, only 1 lead screw that lifts up. But the Prusa's we have 2 motors. Those are hooked up to the same motor controller. They move in sync with each other. And this just lifts the X carriage up. And some printers, like the FlashForge we have, it actually lowers the bed down. Same with the Ender 5, lowers the bed down. it can work either way. It's just a relationship of nozzle to bed. Okay, the most complicated part of your 3D printer is the X-carriage tool head. This often has your extruder, it has your hot end, it has a lot of parts going on. This is your extremely fancy hot glue gun. The rest of your printer is just motion. This is the thing that makes things happen. There's a lot going on here, so we're going to go over each of the parts individually. First, you have your extruder. The extruder is the part that pushes your filament into the printer. There are some that have this off on the side of the printer. There are some that have this directly on top of the hot end, like you see here, this big black box and this motor here. That is the extruder. Basically what this is doing is it's pinching the filament with this like spring and idler up against this knurled wheel here. Knurling is just like little grooves that are meant to eat into the filament so that it can grab. That knurled wheel is hooked up to another stepper motor. This is technically your fourth axis, your E-axis. So if you see a E-axis referred to in like G-code or something, that's what it's talking about, your extruder. And then that is just moving like the other axes. It moves forward a number of steps. You do a bunch of math ahead of time to tell it that if I move so many steps, that extrudes so many millimeters of filament. Pardon me. This part can take a lot of printers look different for this. This is one of the most varied things, but just look for where the filament is getting loaded. And this one on the left is called a Bowden style one. This would be off on the side of the machine, and this is pushing the filament to the extruder. And then ones that are directly on top of the hot end are called direct drive extruders. Those are pulling the filament into the extruder. There are benefits and disadvantages to these two different styles, but we don't really care about those for right now. If you have burning questions about these later, we can talk about it offline. So the titular hot glue gun is your hot end. The hot end is made up of a couple of components here, but really its job is getting hot and not letting that heat go back towards the where the filament is coming from. The bottom part of it here, we have a nozzle. The nozzle is where the plastic comes out. It is typically brass, but can be made out of a variety of different things. Brass is just a very good heat conductor. What it does is it comes to a cone, and then there's a bore at the tip of it that is a set size. The general size of that is about 0.4 millimeters. That's sort of the standard. That can be a bunch of different sizes, and you change those up for a variety of reasons. For smaller diameter ones are going to give you more X and Y detail, but they are also much more likely to get clogged. And larger diameter ones give you less X and Y detail, but allow you to print larger layers because you can extrude more plastic at one time. Aaron, you have a question.
Are these user swappable by the members at the space, or are these stay consistent on the machines?
These generally stay consistent on the machines. If you'd like to know how to swap nozzles, that is a thing that I can train.
All good. I was just wondering if that was something we need to really worry about for a casual printer, but
for a casual
like
printer, no.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and generally I will mark machines that don't have 0.4 millimeter nozzles. We have a couple at the space that have, the Ender 5 has a 0.6 millimeter nozzle because it is just way too massive to use a smaller nozzle. Like if you're printing something that needs that level of XY detail on there, you're doing it wrong. And the PowerSpec Duplicator i3 Plus has a 0.6 millimeter nozzle. So going up from that nozzle, this is also technically a consumable. These wear out over time. And depending on the material that the nozzle is made out of, different materials can be used on the printer. Because if you use things like carbon fiber filament, that's going to eat through brass very quickly. It will, in a single print, turn your 0.4 millimeter nozzle into a 0.8 millimeter nozzle that's all wonky, and you have a garbage nozzle. No joke, it is that quick. Don't use carbon fiber filament on brass nozzles. Around that is the heater block. The nozzle is screwed into this, and this is just a large block of aluminum that houses your heater cartridge, which is that thing sticking out of the side, and then it also houses the thermistor, which tells the board, the controller board, how hot the hot end is, so that it can fluctuate correctly to keep the nozzle in the correct temperature range. Just above that, you have this little skinny thing, the skinny break between that and the fins above it. That's called the heat break. The goal of that is to just separate the heat a little bit from these metal fins above it, which are called the cold side. The goal of the cold side is to have a fan blowing on it and to stop the heat from going any further back than it needs to. You want to heat your filament up and extrude it in as short of a period as you can. The reason for this is that the longer filament stays at temperature, the more it degrades. So if you just have a nozzle sitting on and you have filament cooking in there, it's going to start degrading and leaving deposits on the inside of your nozzle, which is going to cause jams and cause problems. You also don't want the filament that's at the extruder to be getting soft. Because if it's getting soft and things, it gets a little bit mushy, you're going to be having problems extruding as much as you think you're doing. Because you've already done all this math that says, I send so many pulses, I extrude this much filament. If the filament isn't pushing forward like you expect, that throws that math out the window. Also on here, you'll have a part cooling fan. And you notice that this is this fan that's pointed down towards the nozzle. It's actually pointed below the nozzle. Glenn, you had a question. You're muted.
There. Sorry, I was muted. I'm learning. On all of these maths that you're referring to and all these settings,
you don't need to do. That is not something that you need to worry about. I'm saying that's a thing. That's a thing that the firmware has done.
Okay, so it's all in the software, and you just say, please print it, essentially.
Correct.
Wonderful. Thank you.
That is a good clarification, yes. Like, it's not you sitting there with an abacus going, well, for this extrude. No, it's the slicer that we're going to talk about later, that has done the math to say, I think that this is how much that I'd like to extrude. Please do it. Okay, the part cooling fan blows on the part that's being printed. Some plastics, like PLA in specific, need to be cooled off so that when you come back around for the next layer, you're not heating that up enough again so that it becomes a semi-fluid and then droop. So the part cooling fan just cools off your the thing you're printing so that you get a crisper, cleaner print. Some plastics also don't like that at all. Don't turn on the fan for ABS or turn it on very little. But those are settings that we can talk about later. Okay, oops, wrong direction. So now that, actually, before we move on from this, does anybody have any questions about what we've covered for how printers work? Perfect. So from there, we're going to talk about prepping the machine for printing. There are generally these 4 steps. You're going to check the belts and rails for debris. You want to make sure that there's no little bits of plastic in the belts and rails. Those can cause issues with your print. 3D printing tends to generate a lot of these, so it's just good practice to check to make sure that they're clean. The build surface also can have little bits of plastic still stuck on it, so it's good to make sure that there's none of those that are going to mess with your print. You're going to level the build plate. The goal of this, most build plates are on some form of spring system. There's one in each corner and a little knob on the bottom. The goal of this is to make the build surface perfectly perpendicular to the nozzle at every point. You want it like just a little bit above the build surface, about 0.2 millimeters. It's a process of doing that. And then you would, once you're done with that, you will clean and prep the build plate for adhesion. Your goal here is that you want your part to stick to the bed until you're done with it sticking to the bed, which is generally when your print is done. If it comes off before that, your print's going to fail. You'll end up with some nice spaghetti. In the lab, what we generally recommend that you use is Elmer's washable glue stick, just a very thin layer. Most of the build surface is already going to have this on here. You don't need to reapply this every time. It lasts for a while. If your part isn't sticky, you can sort of touch it up. But if you see like a buildup, like if you can see the glue on the build surface and like there's a texture to it, there is too much on there. You should get a wet paper towel, like just very damp, like wring it out. Lie that over the build plate, let it hydrate the glue. It'll all turn purple again, which is nice. And then you can wipe it off and then reapply the glue stick. You're just looking for a thin layer. Also, there are several printers that we have that have Kapton, or not Kapton. Oh, there's one with Kapton. Or PEI, which is this like brownish film on there. Those you can clean with isopropyl alcohol, 90%. +%, just before printing. I mean, like, you should clean the build surface and then hit start. Those are self-adhesive, but they need to be very clean. Glenn.
So this Kapton, PEI, Build Tech, those are actually the plates themselves, or is this an adhesive? Those
are
names.
The build plate. Okay, so Kapton and PEI are types of plastic. They are adhered to the build surface. Build Tack is I think this is on the Ender 5. No, we have glass plate on the Ender 5. We don't actually have any of that in the lab, but it's like a rough textured thing that's meant to be a self-adhesive material. These all are things that are stuck to build plates. The only things that we have are Kapton and PEI. Those look like a brown film. Those are on the Prusas, one of the Enders, and the Flashforge Creator Pro. Those you can clean with isopropyl alcohol if there's no glue on them, but you can also just put the glue stick on it and do that as well. Really, the only reason that you clean off the glue stick and do the IPA is if you absolutely need to have a mirror finish on that side of your part. The glue stick is going to leave not really a texture, but it's not going to be glass smooth. It's not usually a problem because the rest of your part isn't glass smooth, so it doesn't usually bother me, and you tend to have a better success rate. But if you need a perfectly smooth side, you would do something like that. Okay, leveling the build plate. The majority of our printers require you to do this manually. There are a couple of printers that we have that have automatic bed leveling sensors. The Prusas in specific have this, so you don't need to worry about this with those ones at all. But the rest of them have a knob in each corner, and you spin it one way and the bed moves. You compress the spring and you spin it the other way, and the spring releases. So what you're going to do is you're going to home the printer. If you go to the 3D Lab manual, which I should have sent out to all of you all, it was in that email. This has a very detailed step-by-step guide on like how to go through the menu system and click level build plate and all of that. So you can go there for the exact specifics of how to do this. But the general process is going to be that you home the printer, then disable the steppers. If you try to move the the head or the bed of a 3D printer manually and it doesn't move at just a light touch, don't force it. You're just going to break the printer. When the steppers are engaged, you won't be able to move it, but if they're off, it'll move very easily. Then you're going to, at that first corner, so we're in corner 1 now, this is where it homed, you're going to take a sheet of paper and I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Okay. You're going to take your sheet of paper and you're going to come in, say, so my hand is the build surface. You're going to come in like this with a piece of paper. You're not going to push down and put pressure on the build plate while trying to check the level because you'll push down on that spring and you'll get a false level. What you're trying to do is make it so that the nozzle, as it's coming down onto this, you're putting the sheet of paper between the build surface and the nozzle, and you should just get the barest friction when you move this piece of paper back and forth underneath it. It shouldn't grab it. It shouldn't be so loose that you can just slide it in and out willy-nilly without feeling any tension on it. But you shouldn't be in the state where, if you're pushing down on the build surface, you're going to be giving yourself a false level, and you'll get the bed too close. Does that make sense? I rambled a bit there. Okay, I'm getting at least one nod, so I'm going to go with yes. Then you're going to very gently move the nozzle over to the opposite corner, diagonally from this. So you're going to level in this X pattern. You're going to do the same thing in corner 2. Then you're going to go to corner 3, corner 4, and then you're going to check the center. If when you check the center, it's out of level, just do it again. If it's unlevel that time, the build plate might be warped, so you can just sort of average it out. Seth, you got a question?
Yeah, so when you disable the steppers, is it just the X and Ys that are disabled, so it's not going to move up and down on you while you're doing this?
It does disable all the steppers, but on most printers, the lead screws are what's moving it up and down. So it's actually pretty hard to accidentally move it up on the Z.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think the only printer that we have that's sort of easy to accidentally move up on the Z are the Enders, but even them, it's pretty difficult to move it up on the Z by accident. It's easy to move it down on the Z. Where was I? Okay, so you're going to level in all of those, and then you're going to just check to make sure that it's good by checking the center. Glenn.
Yeah, so, maybe you're going to cover it later, and that's cool. But are you going to describe to us how to get it oriented again if you accidentally move it, in a sense that because you said the steppers don't tell you where they're at, and so
Okay.
if I nudge, you see what I'm saying? How do you recover from misaligning your plate?
So in this state, there's no misaligning the plate. The X and the Y, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I have a demo printer here. Okay, can everybody see me?
Yes.
Cool. So here's a printer. This is a really old printer, but so what I would do, I would manually move you wouldn't normally manually move it, but this isn't plugged in right now. So there, that bottomed out the Z. So you can see actually right now my nozzle is basically touching the build surface, but the steppers are off because it's unplugged right now. But I would manually move this all the way forward and move this over here and get a piece of paper and go, okay, how far is this away? And get this under there, and that's too close. So then I would get my Allen key for this one, and I would level that, and I would take it over and move it gently over here, and do the same thing over here, and so on. But at this stage, it doesn't. There's no like misaligning it. Later, before we start printing, the printer will home itself again. If that's the question.
Okay. Yes, that's the question. Thank you.
The thing to know about doing this is that when you move a printer manually, you want to be gentle with it. Like if I move it like this, that's fine. But the thing to remember here is that all electric motors are generators when pushed in reverse. Most 3D printers do not have the sort of backflow protection on their boards that will stop electricity flowing back into the board and frying it. So if you see like the screen flash or something if the printer's off when you're pushing it too fast. You are potentially breaking your printer. So be gentle with it. Like a slow movement like this, that's fine. And yeah, always remember, don't force it, don't move it too fast, and you'll not have any issues. Anything else I want to show on this printer? No, I don't think so. I think we're good. That printer is my first 3D printer, if people are wondering why I have this relic. Okay, so next, after you've leveled the build plate, you're pretty much ready to go. You just need to load your filament. If there's filament already in the printer, you'll need to unload that first if it isn't a filament that you want to use. In the lab, oftentimes printers are already loaded with lab filament, so you don't need to worry about it, but it's always important to check to make sure that the filament loaded on a printer, if you're just going to use that, isn't somebody's personal filament. If it's lab filament, it'll be labeled with a silver Sharpie on the side, really big, it'll say lab. Also on the side of it will be like 385 grams or something. That's the weight of the spool, which will be important later. But just to let people know, we do generally try to label the weight of the spool. If you open a new spool of lab filament, look for the instructions on how to label the spool weight before you use it. Okay, so loading filament, or unloading filament. Glenn.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. The weight that we're marking it with, is that what's on the side of the box, or is there a scale that we actually weigh?
There's a scale. I regret bringing that up now.
Okay, I'll forget it.
No, it's not important to this. It's important for later if you're determining how much filament is left on the spool.
Okay.
What we do is when we buy a new spool, we'll put it on a scale and say, this spool is labeled as being 1 kilogram of filament. So if I put it on a scale and it weighs 1.3 kilograms, that 0.3 kilograms is probably the weight of the spool itself, the plastic spool. So we label the side of it with that. So later when I say, okay, do I have 58 grams of filament on the spool left? I can put it on a scale, and if it weighs the spool weight plus 58 grams at least, I know I have enough. Okay, unloading filament. When you are unloading filament, if you're planning to load something else, you would heat up to the filament that you're changing to. So if I am changing to PETG from PLA, I would heat up for PETG. In this case, if I was doing that, I would heat up to 240 degrees Celsius instead of the 210 to 220 that's required for PLA. Then you would compress the extruder arm, which is this part right here, this top part, or this like orange part on this piece. If you squeeze that down to compress that spring, that's compressing it, and that's going to release the tension on the filament. It's going to move this idler away from the knurled wheel. And that's going to stop it from being able to eat into the filament, so you're going to be able to move the filament in and out. Then you're going to slowly press the filament forward a little bit. And that's going to extrude a little bit of plastic. That's what you want. Oftentimes there's a little bit of a plug on the end of the filament, like a negative of the nozzle. And that can make it difficult to get back out of the, especially if it's like a PTFE lined hot end. PTFE is Teflon. Some hot ends are Teflon lined because it makes them extrude nicer. But you'll need to press forward a little bit to extrude a little bit of plastic, get rid of that plug, and then pull the filament out fairly quickly. And that's basically it. But when you pull it out, you want to make sure that you adhere to what I call the rule of 3. There are 3 places the end of a filament spool goes, and that is securely held in your hand, never letting it go, in the extruder of a in the extruder of a 3D printer, or securely attached to the side of a spool. The rule of 3 is very important because if you let the end of the filament spool go, it's going to want to uncurl off of there. There is some tension on this plastic. And when it uncurls, it can get tangled under itself. And when that happens, it's really hard to see if you've gotten all of the tangles out. Like if it's looped under itself, if one strand is looped under a strand, like the end is looped under a strand that's further along, what's going to happen is that eventually that's going to keep working back and working back and working back until it's to a point where you've created a knot. And then the filament's not going to be able to come unspool off of that anymore because it's knotted. And that can, if you have it on a filament stand, can pull the filament spool down onto the printer and break parts of the printer. That happened maybe a year and a half ago. It can just cause your print to fail because the extruder can't pull the filament, so it just eats through the filament, and then you have that. Really, the only solution to fix that, if you're not sure, is to re-spool the entire thing, which is a pain. And if you do accidentally cause this, the lab rule is that you are responsible for fixing it because it takes like 45 minutes and I don't got time for that. So just be careful. It's pretty easy. Just keep a hold onto it. There are binder clips, these mini binder clips that I like for holding onto the side of the spool. But all spools also have like a little 2 holes that you can loop it through. I'm not super fond of those because a lot of PLAs are pretty brittle, and that can snap off and cause, and then you end up with the same problem. So I prefer these binder clips. There's a little bin of them on the computer desk in the 3D lab. So you've unloaded your filament successfully. Loading the filament works basically the same way. You're going to heat up the hot end if it's not already there. You're going to use a pair of side cutters to clip a little 45 on the end of the filament. That just makes it easier to fit into the different tubes and things that you're going to encounter. And then you're going to push it into the extruder, uncompressed. For some printers, you can do it uncompressed, or for a lot of them, you would just compress the extruder arm, you'd lightly feed it into there, and then you'd keep pressing gently until you see the, pardon me, until you see the new filament color come out of the hot end. And then using a pair of pliers, you can clean the little poop of plastic off of the hot end. Any questions about loading filament? I realize I went through that quickly, but it's not that complicated of a process.
So I do have one. My understanding so far is that you're clearing off the extra that heated up so that you have a clean new end when you start actually extruding. Is that correct?
Let me see. So,
well, think of a toothpaste tube and you've over squeezed it. You end up with a glob hanging off the end.
Yeah.
And your OCD just says, no, we're not going to do that. And you remove the glob so that the toothpaste to come has a good, clean,
Yes.
tidy end.
Okay,
That's
you're
what
asking
you're
about
doing?
that. That's what you're doing to get rid of that's why we remove that little bit of plastic that extruded. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Also, it can cause problems getting in the way. But what you're doing here mainly is putting in a new type of plastic, whether it be a new color, new material, whatever. Okay. Preparing your file for print. So the biggest mistake I see a lot of newbies do is that they go, awesome, I found this file on the internet and I want to print it. So I take my STL and I put it on the SD card and I hit, and I go into the menu and it doesn't show up. And that is because your printer does not understand what a 3D model is. Not in the least. The machine that you have, your 3D printer, understands G-code. And you need to take your 3D model, which is just sort of this mesh mathematical representation of something, and then slice it in a slicer software, which is going to take that model and turn it into like these layers of G-code. And then your printer is going to take that G-code, interpret it, and really G-code is just a bunch of instructions. If you are super determined, or you are a mechanical engineer journey person, and your professor hates you, you can write G-code manually if you really want to. But it's really just a large set of instructions that are like, go here, do that, extrude some plastic, move up, do it again. It's that. It is perfectly human readable and writable. It's been around since the 50s. Obviously, there's been evolutions of it, but it's pretty similar to what it used to be in the beginning. This is the same sort of instruction commands that your like the CNC table in the router table in the CNC lab uses. Same exact thing. It's probably actually similar to what the laser cutter uses, if I'm being honest. A lot of laser cutters do use G-code, but some of them don't. Some of them use, like, I think our full spectrum probably uses something weird, but some of them do use G-code. So I said slicing. What does slicing mean? There are a lot of different applications out there to do this, but the one that we're going to use today, the one that we use in the lab, which is called Prusa Slicer. A slicing software is just a piece of software that takes your 3D model and turns it into G-code for you. It makes those layers. It slices them into layers. Okay. And now I've hit the point of the demo where I realize that some of you can't see my screen still. And I am not sure what to do about that.
I don't know how many of us that is anymore. I think
Okay.
I fixed it. Brian's fixed it. I don't know if anyone else has issues anymore.
Cool. I'm going to keep going. And if you can't see this part, I'll post the link to the video of this later, which can see this. You can rewatch just this section. Prusa Slicer looks basically like this. You have a 3D representation of your build surface in this space. I can left click and drag to rotate, and I can right click and drag to pan. And the first thing I want to do when in here is select the printer that I'm planning on using. If I'm in the lab, let's say I'm going to print something, I want to use a Creality Ender 3. So you see that it has reloaded the build surface to match the size of my Creality Ender 3, which is great. I can know that the thing I'm going to print is going to fit. So let me go to my desktop. Oh, I don't have any. Do I have anything? Ah, yes, there. I load in a model. So I clicked this plus here, this add. I found a model that I wanted to print. I clicked on it and I hit open. And that loaded the model into here for me. You can see that I can click and drag these models around perfectly fine. and I can drag and pan and look at these models in this space. There is some limited amount of manipulation that you can do in here. So say I wanted to print this gear here, this gear here, but I wanted to print it as big as I possibly could. I could right-click on it and go to scale to print volume, and I could print this model as big as I possibly could. There's no particular reason to do that in this case, but sometimes that thing is useful. There's also Control Z if I want to undo things. Yes, Glenn. You're muted.
Oh, yep. Sorry, I'm trying to learn. Okay, so I'm interested in making small mechanical parts similar to what you've done there. Mm-hmm. So being correct dimensionally will become very important to me. And my question is, where in that sequence of designing this in one software and then importing it into Slicer and then all of these steps, where would be the reasonable place to make adjustments if you realize that your end result wasn't dimensionally correct?
The modeling software.
Okay, thank you.
So you can see over on this panel here, this is the size that it thinks it is. It thinks that this part it's going to print is 53 millimeters by 53 millimeters by 17 millimeters tall. That's the bounding box of this part. When you import a thing, an STL into here, it's going to look at the STL, and the STL has units on it. And generally those units indicate whether it thinks those units are inches or millimeters. Sometimes you get a part that doesn't have that, and it just needs to infer. It will guess millimeters. And sometimes you'll import a part, and this was maybe 2 years ago, I imported a part, and it was like zoomed in like this, and there was a tiny green speck in the center of the screen. And that was the part that I imported. For some reason, their units were really wild, and I ended up having to scale the part 10,000% to get it to be 1 centimeter across. That happens, but generally, if you're using decent 3D modeling software, it will have units on there. If you're doing something like making mechanical parts, you're probably using a CAD software, and it will import into here in the correct size. If you've set it 50 millimeters across, it will import here 50 millimeters across. Sometimes you'll import parts, and let's say that they are, if you need to rotate something, you can click this button. You can click on your part, click this rotate, and then that gives you these handles which allow you to rotate the parts in different ways. You can see it popped up there that it tried to put it all above the build surface. You can see I can freely rotate this and move it around as I see fit. Although printing something like this, say you import this model and it came like this, that's not a great way to print something. It's gonna be difficult for it to print. You're gonna need to do a lot of supports. So if I slice this now, I'm gonna leave that here to show you how supports work, but I'll come back to this and I'll explain how to fix a model like this. But let's, for now, say I want to print these two parts just like they are. I imported them. They're like this. I think that looks dandy. So the next thing I would consider when printing is the print settings. The print settings determine mostly, in this case, your layer height. It determines a lot of things, but a lot of things you don't care about right now. At the lab, we have all of these presets for you that set the layer height at different things. The layer height is how much it moves up in between each layer. So if I have a part and I print it at 0.2 millimeter layer height, so that means that each of those levels of it is 0.2 millimeters tall. So 1/5 of a millimeter. 0.2 is sort of the default because it looks 3D printed, but not aggressively so. And it's a nice balance between looking decent and taking forever. The next step down from that in this one's presets is 0.8 millimeters. And if you think about it, mathematically, if I print the same part at 0.8 millimeters that I printed at 0.2 millimeters, the 0.8 millimeter one is going to take at least 220% of the time that the 0.2 one did, because it has to do that many more layers. It's over twice as many layers, and each layer takes a certain amount of time. And the more that you have to do that, the thinner those layers are, the longer your part's going to take. Conversely, the thicker your layers are, the shorter your time's going to take, but the more it's going to look like it has those striations, the less Z detail that you get. So there's going to have those like thick, chunky lines. And for some parts, like if I'm printing a big mechanical part, like let me stop sharing for a second. If I'm printing a big mechanical part like this, I don't care. Like you can see there's these big, focus. There's some chunky lines in here. Trust me, there's chunky lines. My camera's not focusing. I think I printed this at 0.35 millimeter layer height. And honestly, it looks fine. It's gonna be hidden by something, and it's nice and sturdy, and it does what I needed to do. And it took half the time to print than printing it at a lower layer height. But if I'm printing something that I want a lot of detail in, something that is meant to look pretty, printing at a lower layer height is probably worth it. Until you know that you have a good reason to change it, doing 0.2 is a nice default. Okay. So let's see. So I have these parts loaded. I went in here and I select my print settings. Your layer height is, like I said, how far it moves up. The one with a 1 hyphen in front of it is sort of what we consider the default standard. And then the last thing I would need to consider right now is infill ratio. Your 3D printing parts are not solid. A good example of that is, again, so this is a coaster I made. I modeled a solid block, and then I let the infill fill it in. I told it 0 layers top and bottom. So this is one infill pattern called hexagon. And the inside of your 3D print parts looks something like this. You'll have a sort of lattice work that's just meant to support these outer shells. You see these side walls. These are called shells or perimeters. And then you have this lattice work inside. And then as you print up the part, it'll eventually get covered up so that you just have this like nice smooth surface. There are many different types of infill ratio. The default one, infill types. The one that we use in the lab most frequently is rectilinear. There are different. Oh, somebody's dog has gone off. The sort of default standard is rectilinear. Honeycomb is nice for aesthetic things. It used to be the default, but it's actually a little hard on printers. There's a lot of short, jerky movements. And there's also there's a bunch of them. If you go in the lab, there's a couple of samples that show them all off. For most part, you don't ever see it, so it doesn't really matter, except for structural reasons. Rectilinear is a good all-around one that gives you a lot of compressive strength from both directions. So it's a good default. But the infill ratio is the percentage of the inside of your part that is solid. So let's go back to Prusa Slicer. The infill ratio here is, so if I have it set at 20%, that means approximately 20% of the inside of my part, the volume of the inside of my part, is plastic. So how much infill is good? This depends on the type of part you're printing. If I'm printing a statue that's going to sit on a shelf, 5 or 10%. The only real thing that infill is serving is supporting your external perimeters. It's just there to be scaffolding. If the part needs to be strong, so if it's like that part, that red part that I was holding up, that's going to have the weight of a bookshelf on it. That is going to be something that needs a lot more strength. So doing something like 60% infill is probably more close to what I want. Really going above like 80% is very rarely ever worth it. You start creating some structural issues in like where, like unless you have it perfectly level and things, there's no place for excess plastic to go. So then you start getting these blobby parts and things. So the max that you ever probably want to go is 80%. But as a general rule of thumb, if it's a pretty sculpture that doesn't need any structural support, 5 or 10%. If it's a structural part that needs a lot of strength, something like 70 or 80% is probably where is the sweet spot. So let's say these are they need some support, but like they need to be strong but not overly strong. Let's say 40%. So I have my two parts here. This part is you see that it starts printing on the bed. So you'll see that it starts printing here, and then it's going to start printing up. But this is sort of hanging off into space. So let's actually rotate this to an even worse position. So let's say it's like this. This is not going to be able to physically be able to print. That's not how physics works. Your part isn't going to stick to the bed because it's touching down by this like nanometer size thing, and then this is just hanging off into space. So you might say, oh, that's not printable like that. It is. You can use something called support. So support is scaffolding that the slicer will make to support the part for you. So let's turn on supports. Let's say supports from build plate only. This is this drop down here. And then if I hit slice down here, it's going to generate the G-code for me and give me a preview of the G-code. So if you look at these parts, it's not my parts anymore. It's not the 3D models. It is a rendering of the G-code file. And you can see that it built all of this scaffolding for me off of this. Oh, that's good to know. It built all this scaffolding for this part, and that is what's going to make that printable. So if I use this slider over here and I slide down, you can see that inside the part there's that infill that we talked about, that lattice work, and you can see there's all this support and things. And you probably noticed that there's this weird hole in my part, where if I go back to here, there's not a hole here. If I go to here, there's this weird hole. And you can see it more if I turn off supports. So why did this happen? This was not planned, but this is a good example. I'm going to save this part. This is an example of a part that had geometry issues. There were holes in the part, and the slicer didn't know how to deal with it. So it did what it thought was right, but obviously that's not right. And this is why it's always important to look at the G-code to make sure, like slide down this bar and make sure that every layer of your part, it's doing something that looks like it makes sense. So if I just looked at this part and I came up to like here, oh, that looks fine. And then you get to, oh, that's not right. that part's just floating above it, and then there's more junk here. This part is never going to work. So is there something that we can do about that? And you can actually see the slicer is warning us about it here. It has this 1,246 errors. If I right-click it, it's going to use NetFab to try and repair that model for us. Oftentimes, files online weren't necessarily generated correctly, or there are what's called manifold issues. That's when a part isn't watertight, meaning that there's the shell outside of it, but there's not. Yeah. So you can see it fixed the part, but it also took away that hole in the center. So I'd probably do, if I was really trying to print this part, is I would take this model into a different program and try and fix it manually. Probably something like Mesh Mixer, because NetFab helped, but not in the way that I needed to. But let's pretend that this fixed it like what we wanted. Slicing it and printing it on this angle used all that support, and let's say we didn't want to do that. There is a way I can see to print this without using support at all. So if I select this part and I click this button here, this is Place on Face. And that's going to highlight all of these different faces of this, and I can click on one of them, and I'll rotate the part to put that face down on the bed. I could have done that manually. It's very difficult to do it manually. This button is an awesome lifesaver. But now, if you see I slice these, the part doesn't need support anymore, and it's lying face down on the ground on the bed, and there's no more of those weird holes that were present before. Also in this G-code rendering, you can see this hiccups. This outline around this, that's called a skirt. That is just the nozzle priming itself for the first layer. To make sure that, it's also sort of a safety check for you to make sure, okay, if it can draw the skirt, I put everything on the build plate correctly. It's sort of that, in that aspect, it's sort of a holdover from old 3D printers where you didn't, and slicers where you didn't really have that guarantee that you have now. Okay. I think that was a lot of it. So I have my part. It's going to slice. Come on, finish slicing. There's a progress bar down in the bottom corner. I feel like this part still, the part that we repaired still has some weirdness about it. When it takes a while to slice, it's generally because there's a lot of geometry. And NetFab sometimes fixes things and makes the files massive. But should be done any second now. While we're waiting, does anybody have any questions about slicing? Okay. Yes, Seth.
I think I heard you say that there's slicing software on the lab computers.
Yes.
It's
this one.
Free versions that you can get on your own machine?
Yep. Prusa Slicer is free. It is open source. You can go to Prusa, just like Google Prusa Slicer, and it'll come up. And in that handout, in that email, there's also the lab presets that you can download and import. For some of there's also some like ancillary. Do you have a Windows or a Mac computer?
Either.
Okay. The lab machine is a Windows computer, and there are some weirdnesses with the FlashForge Creator Pro actually uses like compiled G-code. So there's like a post-processing script for that to turn it into an X3G file. And the Ender 5's firmware doesn't let you have it doesn't read G-code files names if they're longer than 15 characters. They made some choices with the firmware. I've attempted to fix it, but the screen is weird. So there are some scripts that you put in a specific place for those specific printers if you want to slice it on your personal computer. But other than those ones, all the presets are there for you. Something that you may encounter in the lab too is if a printer tells you, flashes as has on its screen incorrect printer error, that means that you have sliced your file with a setting for a different printer than the one you're attempting to print on. This is a firmware thing that I implemented because we have a lot of different types of printers. And the settings are very printer specific, so it is easy to do damage to a printer by trying to use G-code meant for a different printer. So that check is there to make sure that you have selected the right printer. If you see that error, you do need to hard reset, like power off and power on the printer before you're able to use it again. What that means is that you had the wrong setting. You can either figure out what printer you had sliced it for and go use that printer instead, or you can go back to the computer and slice it for the correct printer. All the printers are labeled. You see like this parentheses C3. That is a specific printer. Actually, these codes have updated, and I'm going to update the names of these in here. But the two Prusas actually use the same one. Glenn, you had a question.
Twofold. The first one is, are all of these software machinations described in the handout?
Yes.
Okay, and then the second one is, if you have two printers at the lab that are the same make and model, are they still considered separate iterations? And so like CE3 can be this Ender 3. Is there a CE4 that's also a
No.
Ender 3?
So the only ones that we have that are duplicates are the Prusa MK3S. We have two of those. Those are going to be the same one. Every single one of our Enders is modified in a different way because most of them have been donated. Those each have their own things. These the presets I have in here are a little bit old. This is my personal computer at home. But those each have their own thing.
Okay.
Good question. Okay, so I've sliced my model. I've slid through this the G-code to make sure that it looks like it's printing what I think makes sense. This looks good. And then let's look down the bottom corner over here. I can see that this says that it's going to use 18.13 grams of filament. This is where that spool weight comes into effect. I can then take my spool of filament and go weigh it and say, like 18 grams is not very much. That's 6 meters of filament, so 18 feet. That's not a very large amount of filament. But if I look at the spool, I can say, does that have 18 grams of filament on it before I start my print? You don't want to run out of filament in the middle of a print. And then I can also see that based off of what I told the filament cost, this costs 54 cents to print. So that's how I know how much to put, if I'm using lab filament, how much I should donate. Pardon me. There's a cat piggy bank on the desk that you can drop money in, or we just implemented paying for material use on Clubhouse. If you want to pay digitally, you can pay on there. Yes, Seth.
Does the lab have TPU to use?
Do we have TPU? Right? I don't believe we have TPU right now. We just did a filament order. But if you have, we've had a couple of people ask about TPU, so ping me after this, and we can maybe get everybody together and buy a single spool because it's extremely expensive. A typical spool of PLA costs about $20 for a decent spool. For a kilogram, TPU tends to be about $40 or $50 for a half kilogram. So 4 or 5 times more expensive. It also has some issues in that it absorbs water really quickly, so you need to dry it out between each print. Just something to think about. If you have a small thing that you need TPU for, I think I have a sample in a like sealed bag I can give you that's made from recycled tires. I for a while did a like filament sample of the month thing just to try out some stuff. Okay, so I have this already, and I just click export G-code, and I would save it to the SD card of my printer. There's an SD card reader behind the keyboard. Be gentle with it. Contacts go up. It's all labeled. We've been through a bunch of SD card readers, so this is the most rugged one we've found, but it's still, SD card readers aren't the most rugged things out there, so just be gentle with it when you are putting the SD card in and out. Make sure you're putting the correct direction. The reason that we say, we often get a question of, why can't I just print directly from the computer? The reason is that we have so many different printers, and oftentimes people want to be printing multiple things at the same time. So practically, it makes most sense to print from the SD card, but also it's more reliable than printing from the computer. It's not like your document printer where it sends the whole job to the printer and then the printer just deals with it. That's not how it works. When you're printing from your computer, what it's doing is communicating each line of G-code one at a time to the printer. So it's an active connection for the whole process. If your print is 37 hours, that is 37 hours that your computer needs to not get turned off, not go to sleep, not update, just be controlling this thing. And if your computer goes to sleep in the middle of it, that's your print done. It's unrecoverable. You've wasted 18 hours of print time and a bunch of plastic, and it's done. So for that reason, we suggest always printing off of SD cards. All the printers we have an SD card, and you just pop it in the printer, and then you would go through the menu and click Start. Let me stop sharing my screen and share the presentation again. Okay. So to start it, like I said, you would make sure that you've inspected the machine. You'd level the bed, clean the build plate, do all that. You'd load the G-code onto the SD card. And then you would, again, there are instructions for exactly how to do this in the 3D Lab manual. You would click the print from SD card option in the menu. You go to your G-code file in there. They're going to be chronologically ordered in most recent on top on all of our printers. So it should be the first file listed. And then you select it, and then your involvement is basically done at this point. You're going to stay in the lab and watch at least the first layer complete, though. It'll take a while to heat up. It'll home itself. It will do a bunch of stuff, and it'll start printing. And you need to watch that first layer complete because about 95% of the time, if a print had failed, it fails in the first layer. If it makes it past the first layer, you're generally good. Very few prints fail after that. I mean, it happens, but 95% of the time that a print fails, it fails in the first layer. And that's, the part doesn't stick, it gets a little, like your bed level wasn't right, the filament wasn't loaded correctly, or something like that. There are a lot of things to look out for. If your print is too low, you'll see sort of like wispy plastic sort of smudged on there. You may hear some clicking from the extruder as it's like not able to shove plastic down because there's too much back pressure. If it's too high, you'll see the stringiness as your part is not getting the like being able to stick the plastic down as well as it should. What you're looking for is that middle section there. You may also have your part warp in the first layer, which means that the edges are lifting up, which can cause your part to fail. If that's the case, you may consider using a brim, which is just a check mark like under support. A brim is just extends the first layer of your part out and sort of helps it hold down. This is also good for small parts. If I have this like little like quarter size thing and it's not wanting to stick because there's just not enough surface area there, add a brim. That will extend it out, give you that base that you need, and then you just sort of like flex it up and break it off later. It comes off very easily when the part's done. Glenn.
Yes, this brim that you're describing, is that something that, where in this iteration of softwares do you add the brim?
So if I go into, here's a slicer. There's a checkbox right here that says brim.
Ah, slick. And does it just automatically determine how much brim is useful, or is that a setting?
It's a setting, but the default is fine.
Okay. Thank you.
You can see now that it added that little hat brim around it. Okay. So the last thing that we need to talk about quickly, and I realize that we're running out of time, is filaments. There's a useful chart here. My spiel is that you should use PLA until you've done at least 10 prints. PLA is just by far the easiest thing to print. We have a lot of PLA in the lab that you can use. You don't need to go out and buy your own. If you do want to go out and buy your own, you need 1.75 millimeter filament, not 3 millimeter, not 2.85, 1.75. All of our printers at the lab use 1.75. That is just the diameter of the filament. There are two standards. There's 2.85 and 1.75. Sometimes 2.85 is labeled as 3 for weird reasons that nobody cares about. But in general, unless you know you need a different thing, PLA is good. It's doesn't warp a lot. It doesn't require a lot of heat. It doesn't even technically need a heated bed to work. A lot of these other ones need a heated bed or a heated build chamber to work. ABS in specific needs a very hot heated bed as well as a enclosed build chamber and all of these things. Otherwise, you look at it funny and your print's going to fail. ABS loves to warp. ABS is what they make Legos out of, and it just loves to warp. It's a very resilient plastic, but it's just it shrinks quite a bit, and that shrinkage is what makes it warp, because you have part of your part that's still hot and part of it that's cooling, and the part that is cooling is shrinking a little bit, and if that is shrinking at a different rate than the rest of it, that's where you get warpage from. If you need something that's going to work like outside, I would recommend PET. PET is what they make water bottles out of. PETG is more commonly what you see in the 3D printing space. It's PET but has glycol in it, and that makes it a little bit easier to print. Has very similar properties to PET. I'd say it's a little more flexible in that PET wants to bend and like be a little bit more elastic when you bend it, whereas PLA, if you bend it too far, it wants to shatter. PLA is very brittle. Glenn.
Yes, kind of an odd question, but are any of these food grade and
No.
structurally, none of them?
So, okay. How to put this? So, technically, yes. both PLA and PET/PETG are food grade? Practically no.
Good enough. I'm not going to risk it.
So the practically no means that I don't know. I don't have 100% certainty in the lab to say, I don't know what the person printing on this printer before me used. And was that food grade? I don't know. And then you also have the issue of 3D prints have texture to them. Those texture harbor bacteria. And it's very difficult to clean those parts in such a way that you can be certain to say, this is food safe. So technically food grade, food safe, I wouldn't. I have printed cookie cutters before. I do that actually fairly frequently, but I will wrap them in tinfoil or plastic wrap. The other thing that you could do is coat something that you have, like if I wanted a cup or something, I would coat it in a food safe epoxy resin. And then you've filled in all those gaps, you've made it watertight, you've made it into something that can be food safe. Does that make sense? Cool.
Yes, thank you.
This chart is in the handbook as well as posted in the lab. And if you have any questions about filaments in specific, you can ping me or ping the 3D Lab channel in general on Slack, and we can talk about filaments. There are some links in the handbook as well for where to get filament. If you want to buy it locally, you have basically one choice, and that's Micro Center. And they have 2 lines of filament. One is hot trash, and that's their basic PLA. And that is banned at the lab because it is such trash. And it has broken printers. There was a ball bearing in the filament. It is garbage filament. Basically, the difference between $10 spool filament and $20 spool filament is that they run it on the same machine, but twice as fast. And you just get all of these inconsistencies, and since you're pushing the machine too hard, you can get foreign objects in your filaments when you're doing that, and it's not worth your time. Spend the extra couple of dollars on a slightly nicer spool of filament. It'll make your life easier, is my general feeling on it. If you want a good deal on filament that is good quality, I would say 3D Fuel. They're from North Dakota. They make it all in North Dakota, and it is very high quality filament, and it gets here. Their shipping is super fast. It's usually like 2 days, and it's here. If you're interested in getting started in 3D modeling, these are all free or open source, and still free. If you don't know where to get started, use Tinkercad. Its website, don't need to install anything, has a great tutorial. If you're interested in computer-aided design, I would suggest Fusion 360. It is free for hobbyists. As long as you're making less than $10,000 a year on your hobby, you're good. There's also OpenSCAD if you feel like programming your model. If you're into mesh modeling, so what do I mean by mesh modeling? So CAD is like I have my part, and this hole is 3.875 centimeters on center from this hole, and this part is 20 millimeters in diameter, and stuff like that. It's the mechanical design generally is what you're using CAD for. Mesh modeling is actually there's a class coming up on it that Derek is teaching on using Nomad Sculpt, and oftentimes how that is represented is sort of you have this clay ball and you're modeling in a 3D space this sort of clay-like structure. It's very much like modeling clay in digital. And it's called mesh because you are making a mesh of generally different types of like triangles and things. That is more technical than I need to be, but yeah. We talked about where you can get filament, and if you have questions about what printer you should get, if you're not like a member of the Makerspace and you took this class to get information on 3D printers because you're interested in getting started, you can email me at 3dlab@tcmaker.org and we can talk about it, or you can hang out after class and we can talk about it. Any questions before we wrap up? Seth?
Yeah. Are the slicer softwares, like the one you showed us, particular about what kind of file they take?
They take a large variety of files. They take, let's see, STLs are the most common one that you're going to find out there. And all the slicers that you can find are going to take STLs. They'll also take OBJs, 3MFs, OGGs, I think they'll take sometimes. The, let's see, slicer, imports, OBJ, AMFs, 3MFs, STLs, as well as a couple of other things. So the answer is not particularly choosy. They'll import a lot of different things. STLs, OBJs, and 3MFs are the most likely ones that you'll see. An STL is a stereolithography file. For people that are wondering, that is the most basic type of 3D model file that's out there, and that's also far and away the most common one that you're going to see. OBJs are STLs that also have color information. So this is like if you had a model that had been painted, that's going to be exported as an OBJ. 3MFs are 3D manufacturing files, is what 3MF stands for. That is a more recent standard that is specifically meant for 3D printing. And it's kind of like an STL, but it has some more information in there. Those are a little bit more rare, but they are up and coming, I would say. Okay. Any other questions? Aaron, you usually have a lot of questions, but you're being very quiet today.
I'm good. You've covered it well.
Okay. If you ever have any questions or concerns or comments, you can reach me at 3dlab@tcmaker.org. You can reach out on the hashtag DPT3DLab on Slack. And you can also reach the assistant manager, Jason. He has office hours every once in a while. I think he's going to be starting those up again next month. I think those are once a week on Sundays, I want to say. But keep an eye out for those. And in the normal times, I'm usually in on Saturdays at some point. So you can catch me around the lab then. If you see a printer that's broken, orange tag it and email me or post in Slack. If you just have any questions, always feel free to ask. It's always better to ask than guess and break something. Seth.
First, thank you very much for this. This is hugely informative. And I guess my last question is, are we allowed to go do this now?
You are allowed to go do this now. This was everything you needed. We put together the 3D Lab handbook too, because I realized this is, while it is as basic as I can make it to get started, it's a lot of information. All of this is covered in a lot of detail there as well. So if you get to the lab and you have the, oh no, I don't remember how to do this, it's probably covered in the lab handbook. So you can check that out.
I will definitely consult that. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Aaron.
I lied. I do have a question. Is the 3D Lab computer password protected or anything?
It is. Good call out. The password is 3D printer. All lowercase, all one word. It should be taped to the monitor, the password. The only reason it has a password is that the network rules require it to have a password, but it's a public computer, so. It is common courtesy to not use that computer for anything other than, like, if you need to download a file, that's fine, and slice your file, but then don't use that computer to browse the internet. Yeah. So go forth and print things, and good luck. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a good rest of your weekend, everybody.
Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Thanks for your time, Joseph.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.